Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Discomfort-Zone podcast.
The idea to cross the ape man with the Annunaki. Slaves, work animals, created for one person, to unburden the gods.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode, as per usual. And we got an exciting one this time, wow. So after much anticipation, at least on my end, I hope yours as well, we have reached the final episode in our Sitchin Annunaki series, let's call it. So I hope, we have a lot to get through, but I hope that today will be the last episode. So I'm hoping to leave some time at the end as well for some questions, to go over things, etc. If you have anything you've been waiting to ask, then now is the time. And as I said also, next week I'm going to have, we'll see how much people are interested. There's no need if you don't have anything burning, but I was thinking of doing like a Q&A and also presenting what the next series is going to be like. But enough about that. Let's jump right in. Thank you very much in chat, Patient Zero and Rondon, Revised Sociology. As always, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. And if there are any problems with the audio or anything, just let me know. I had a little bit of a scare just before we started, but I think we're okay now. So, let's get into it. If you'll remember, at the end of last week's episode, we basically reached that very bizarre war, the War of 9 Kings, 4v5, and Abraham, who sort of played a very significant role in that. And over the last few episodes, as we've discovered Abraham's character and role, we see that he was a rather crucial player in those times. And it seems that it's not by chance that his life coincided with the end of an era, which I hope is what we're going to go over today. Now, for those who have been paying attention, you'll notice that Sumer in general and Ur have been crumbling over the last few centuries, a lot of unrest. The empire is sort of falling apart. A lot of the nations and allies that were paying tributes and were respecting Ur's authority as the capital slowly start to resist and change. They stop sending the contributions and the traditional ceremonial symbolism that shows that Ur is the chosen city. And this happens, obviously, over the last few centuries with various kings, but it seems to now be reaching some kind of crescendo. Excuse me. Now, on top of this, if you'll recall, Marduk, and more specifically his son, Nabu, his son is in Babylon and the area and Mesopotamia, since Marduk is still in exile, and he is recruiting people to his father's cause, and he is turning these cities away from Ur and the olden ways. And if we'll look back to a few episodes before, we see that this is precisely what we were discussing when we were talking about the wars of the Titans versus the Olympians, the olden gods versus the new gods. This is the end, or as it were, of that very long conflict. So in one sense or another, the gods and therefore the civilizations and the people have been at war for the last few centuries. And with Ur still crumbling, Marduk sees it as his time. And in fact, it's been the 24 years that were predicted, if you remember, that Marduk was told by an oracle that he will be allowed to rule after a 24-year wait. And now that time has come. And so Marduk decides to invade from the west to Mesopotamia. Now, the invasion actually goes very well because Ur and the whole empires in the area are not at their peak, and Marduk is able very easily to take the fortresses around. The king in Ul and the soldiers decide to sort of fortify the city, to stay there and to focus on trying to defend it from the invaders. And so with this attitude, Marduk and his followers are able to capture most of these cities, and they reach all the way to Enlil's city of Eridu. Hive QA and Inertia, thank you very much for joining. Pleasure to have you here as always. Now, at this point in the story, you'll have to remember that a lot of this information is coming from various different cultures, and Sitchin is doing, again, an incredible work of collecting all of these different pieces of information that corroborate each other and building this whole narrative. And as part of this, there are some, well, all of the events really have two sides. One of the, each side explaining what happened or describing it from their own point of view, usually in relation to the god that they worship specifically. And so the tale that comes to us that Sitchin stands by is that Ninurta, and along with Nergal, are sent to stop the invaders from the west, and the fighting between them and between Marduk and Nabu is quite ferocious, and during those long battles, both sides seem to be deteriorating into more and more animalistic, and they in fact start desecrating a lot of these sacred sites and the temples from both sides, it appears. But the tale that's told is that when they reach Enlil's sacred temple, it is actually Nergal, who once again is Marduk's younger brother. He is Enki's son, and he is on the side of Ninurta and of the rest of the Annunaki, basically, against Marduk and his uprising. So although they're brothers, they are now enemies. Nergal was the one who first went to persuade Marduk to step down peacefully and succeeded. And at this point, they are now fighting. And Nergal is the one who destroys Enlil's temple. Now, the reasoning for this isn't entirely clear, but what is suggested by Sitchin at least, Nergal obviously has much less respect to Enlil's temple than Enlil's son Ninurta, but he does this in an effort to frame Marduk. And indeed, when Enlil hurries back to see who has defiled his temple and what has happened, Ninurta immediately faces him and tells him that Nabu and Marduk are the ones who destroyed his temple. And with this, as expected, Enlil becomes enraged and obviously makes it a high priority to deal with this Marduk situation. Now, throughout all of this time, well, indeed, we haven't spoken a lot about the Annunnaki's politics and the way that they dealt with these things. We've mentioned it a bit in the beginning, but the Anunnaki had a council of 12, the leading Anunnakis, the pantheon, as it were, and they would convene and decide all of those things. We mentioned it in the beginning a lot with the creation of humans and with the decision of destroying, as it were, humanity with a flood. Those were decisions that happened within the council. And within this council, Enlil is the leader here on Earth. He is the chief. And Anu is the king who is the leader on Nibiru. Sorry. So, during this time, there has been an ongoing war council of the Anunnaki with this situation of unrest, the kings going after different gods, failing in the attacks. All of this is alongside being sort of managed, as it were, through this council of war of the Anunnakis. And so at this point, Nergal comes to Marduk, and he actually confronts him, and he decides he asks him to step down from this invasion and from this attack. And Nergal is going by the authority of the Council of the Anunnaki, the Council of War. Marduk, of course, refuses, since, as he both feels, believes, and has seen, this is his moment. He's waited thousands, literally thousands of years for this, And at this point, there's no stopping him. He's already succeeded, and the war is continuing, and he is still capturing city after city, although the Anunnaki are fighting back as well. And so this is all sort of going on at the same time, and Nergal comes to him to attempt some kind of negotiation, is refused, and at this point he returns to the Council of War. Now this is sort of, as it were, one of the turning points in the story. We've heard mention of these weapons before, but at this point Nergal insists that they must use what he calls, and Sitchin's translated as, the awesome weapons. Now, we've actually mentioned them very, very briefly long ago, because the seeds for this whole plot twist that's coming, what happened to humanity's fate and the Anunnaki, the seeds were sown a long time ago. And if you'll recall, the first Anunnaki to ever arrive on Earth was, in fact, it wasn't Enki, but it was Alalu, who had escaped Nibiru and was the first one to even consider arriving at Earth. Now, when he came in a spaceship which he stole, and in that spaceship, as was customary, there were nuclear missiles. Now, he had used one of those missiles, it's explained, to get through the asteroid belt, and he sort of blew a hole through the asteroid belt, and that's how he got through. But there was still other warheads on the spaceship, and as soon as he landed on Earth, not when he landed, sorry, but when Enki landed, they decided to bury the weapons and hide them somewhere in order to, well, prevent anything happening. And so we skip forward a few thousand years, and at this point Nergal is suggesting that they should use these same nuclear weapons in order to stop both Marduk and Nabu, and he is quite insistent on killing these gods in the cities. Now, as is per usual with our story, our so-called hero, Enki, is the first one to stand up and to adamantly refuse the use of such weapons, and Nergal doesn't take this very well. Now, in fact, at this point, Enki, who has sort of been inclined to this position from the beginning, once again suggests to allow Marduk to have his time and to have Babylon as the next ruling kingdom. But he and Nergal actually get to quite a fierce confrontation, and in the end of it, he demands that Nergal should leave the council. And so Nergal leaves in, quite a huff, and he decides to go to where the weapons are buried and to go and use them nonetheless. And so he starts the process, which is they are rather well hidden, not everyone knows, and he starts asking around and getting some information. And this arouses the attention of one of the nearby gods, who is actually, I wouldn't say loyal and ally, but a friend of Marduk's. And he goes to Marduk and tells him that he's seen Nergal preparing or going after the nuclear weapons, and decides to warn him, basically. At this point, Marduk obviously gets quite worried, and he goes to his father Enki to tell him the news. Enki is shocked, and he returns to the Council of War, and there he is met with something he didn't expect, which is that the rest of the gods had already suspected that was what Nergal would go and do. And in fact, as much as Enki was opposed, it seems that some of the Anunnaki, Enlil and Ninurta, are very much in favor of using the weapons. Now, as this is a big decision and it's two opposing sides, the decision actually goes up to Anu, and Anu decrees that they shall use the weapons with a few conditions, so as not to simply reap havoc and uncontrollable, but to actually use them specifically. And it is decided that Ninurta should go to Nergal and tell him about the decision, and to make sure that it happens as is required. And so Ninurta leaves and goes to where Nergal is, finds him already priming the weapons before he had received the confirmation, as it were. Now, at this point, there's a very long discussion that happens between the two, and I won't go into too much detail, but it is interesting to note that one of the arguments that that Ninurta tries to persuade, excuse me, Nergal to move away is, I'm sorry, just one moment. Sorry about that, something in my throat. One of the arguments that Ninurta uses to persuade Nergal is actually very similar to something we find in the Old Testament. And so at this point we can actually recall a very famous story from the Old Testament, which, if you'll have a guess as to what could have been this nuclear disaster, as it were, it's what we have come to know as the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, the fire and brimstone in the description of Sodom and Gomorrah have obviously been talked about much, and various scholars and different people have offered solutions as to what it may have been and whether it was natural, etc., etc., etc. But Sitchin's evidence is very, very persuasive, as always, in my opinion, proving that a few of these, to draw just one simple difference between this and the flood, in this case, it's clear from the Bible that the event was triggered, was controlled, and could be postponed. And there's a point where the angels who have arrived to the city, who had visited Abraham before, go to save Lot from Sodom and Gomorrah. And when they talk to Lot, they tell him to get as far away as possible and to take his family. And Lot says that he is afraid that he won't make it in time. And so the angels tell him that he shouldn't be afraid, and they will wait until he has reached the farther cities, and only then will they let the havoc wreak. And so this is a very different approach from what we remember when Enki spoke to his son, saying, in 7 days the waters will come and there's nothing we can do to stop it. You have to be prepared by then. So I won't go into any of the archaeological evidence, and I'm not here again to persuade anyone by anything, but we're going to continue with Sitchin's narrative. And in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, for those who don't remember, Abraham is approached by the 3 angels and is told to leave the city, and so is his nephew Lot. And at this point, Abraham enters, not at this point, but a bit later, Abraham enters into a discussion with God, with the Lord, claiming, what if there are 50 righteous people within Sodom and Gomorrah? Would you destroy the 50 with the not righteous? And this discussion has become rather famous. This is actually echoed, or I should say the original, with the discussion between Ninurta and Nergal regarding the nuclear missiles. And so basically, Ninurta comes to him and tells Nergal that Anu's terms are that only the approved cities can be targeted, that the Annunaki and the Ijiji of those cities will be warned ahead of time, and that the humans of those cities will be forewarned as well, will be spared. Now, at first, Nergal doesn't have any of it, and he is really rather upset. But again, Ninurta sort of enters this long persuasion, giving all of these examples, and in the end, Nergal agrees to all of the accounts, except that he doesn't agree to warn Marduk or Nabu or their followers, which is sort of not what the agreement was. But in the end, with some more pleading, Nergal agrees to destroy only the cities where Nabu may be and the spaceport, and not the other cities. So, yeah, absolutely. Patient Zero said, when you try to get God not to engage gross generalizations, and he just says, but I'm right. So I like that. And again, this story gets a very different feel, and this in the Jewish Bible, this discussion between Abraham and God is very out of the ordinary. When God came to Abraham and told him to kill his only son, he agreed to do it without hesitation for no apparent reason. But when God is threatening to kill these strangers, because they are all evil, then suddenly Abraham feels the right to plea for their lives. So it's just interesting when you think about, again, how different these stories are when we're considering different characters, not God and the human who worships him, but these two gods who are trying to prevent some sort of nuclear holocaust. And so, indeed, Nergal finally agrees to the terms, and it turns out from the text that Ninurta himself doesn't... sorry, I missed one small point. One other point that Nergal said was that he wished to destroy the spaceport in Nippur. Now, in the crossing point. Now, this comes as a rather shock to everyone, but the reason is that he wants to prevent Marduk from being able to take over the spaceport. And in his mind, after all of the wars that have been fought over it, it sort of needs to be taken out of the picture, as it were. And for some reason or another, Ninurta, upon hearing this condition, is rather shocked, but he consults and relays it to Enlil and Anu, and they both agree to these terms. So it seems that everyone is really quite ready for a change, and the war seems to have taken its toll on everyone. And so it happens. And they each take, as it were, one missile, one for the spaceport, one for the city where Nabu was last reported in. And Nergal fires the first nuclear missile into the spaceport in the mountain, and Ninurta thereafter fires the missile into the city. And as a matter of fact, it turns out that Nabu manages to escape and to reach one of the other islands. But at this point, there's a rather unfortunate and apparently unforeseen element that nobody sort of saw coming. And that is, after this explosion, which happens very near to the west, where they are and where Marduk's invasion began, the explosion obviously decimates the area immediately around it. But then there starts to come this wind, and it's described in all of these lamentations as an evil wind, and it starts spreading across the land, and it starts carrying radioactive particles, eastward. And the descriptions, and there are many of them that Sitchin goes over, which we won't go into too many, but the descriptions are of, as you would expect, something like this to be. All of these cities where both the Annunaki were and the humans who were worshipping them and were on the same side began to be afflicted by this invisible death that was coming without warning. And it seems that there was very little that they could do to stop it, even the Annunaki, as it were. And so when this wind started moving across, a lot of the different cities started to be in absolute chaos. And the Anunnaki not only didn't have time to warn the people, but they actually often didn't even have time themselves to get everything ready. And so I'd like to read just one very quick description from Uruk, which was one of the cities. And I'm just going to read the quotation. I'm not going to post it up this time, and I think it'll be easy enough to follow. In Uruk, the populace was left in chaos, leaderless and helpless. Mob panic was brought about in Uruk. Its good sense was distorted. The shrines were broken in, and their contents were smashed as the people asked questions. Why did the god's benevolent eye look away? Who caused such worry and lamentation? But their questions remained unanswered, and when the evil storm passed over, the people were piled up in heaps. A hush settled over Uruk like a cloak. Now it seems that this description of an eerie silence where everything sort of stopped is a description again from thousands and thousands of years ago that is very hard to match when we think, unless we get to some form of radiation, where radiation is truly this, as it were, wipes everything out, all forms of life, and this deathly silence seems to follow. Another short description that I'd like to read comes from Enki. Now, at this point, obviously, all of the gods, all of the Anunnaki, have been leaving their cities, some staying for more time and closer to the dangerous point, some even getting afflicted slightly by the radiation in some descriptions, but all of them obviously leave eventually. And Enki, as he is leaving, decides only to leave far enough to get out of the evil wind's way, but near enough to stay and see its fate. And so it's described, its lord stays outside his city. Father Enki stayed outside. For the fate of his harmed city, he wept with bitter tears. Many of his loyal subjects follow him, camping on its outskirts. For a day and a night they watched the storm put its hand on Eridu. So this description, which I won't go into, but if you are interested, there's obviously a lot of different lamentations that were written, both during the time that it was happening in Ur, and indeed even hundreds and a long time later by other people who were sort of remembering in the name of. This event seems to be a very important event in human history that until now might have been seen as sort of different unconnected events in human history, that now we get this glimpse into Sitchin's narrative of how these stories might fit in together. Okay, so let's see, 11:30. Do we have any questions? Nice, Annunaki. Sorry, I couldn't read that. Just to make sure it all sounds okay still, because I have a little bit of a delay, but as long as it sounds okay out there, then we are okay to continue. So let me know if there are any problems. So at this point, whether or not we believe Sitchin's narrative, I was interested in investigating a little bit more because I couldn't quite understand how there could be such a nuclear event not that long ago, 5,000-6,000 years ago, as it were, and still, 4,000 years ago, and not to have any kind of evidence for it, as it were. Now, I did a little bit of research into this, and I'm in no way an expert, obviously, but I was quite surprised to discover that in Hiroshima, the radiation levels have actually returned to normal already within, 70 years, more or less, 80 years, something like that. So I was very surprised to find that, but it turns out that, when I think the natural environment is doing what it can to stabilize the situation, the radiation levels can actually decrease rather more quickly than I thought. And if I think for those of you who have been here from the first episode, I think we mentioned the fungi that eat radiation and actually clean the pollution, the radiation, sorry. And so in the discussions that Sitchin brings later, it seems that it took 7 years until people could start going back to live in these places and to settle them again. But that was, and this is what's described, with the help of Enki and his technology. So it seems, although, again, Sitchin doesn't go into much detail, and this isn't something that's very widely spoken about in the past, it seems that there was more help with the Anunnaki's technology to restore the situation and to lower the radiation levels, which we can sort of understand since our technology today is certainly a lot more capable than it was when Hiroshima happened and no one really knew what to expect. So once again, as is the case with other things, Sitchin mentions that prior to the 1940s, no one reading these descriptions from ancient history would be able to suspect something like a nuclear explosion. It was only until we reached that same technology ourselves that we could start making sense of these descriptions. This evil wind that invisibly swept across the land and brought utter desolation, not in the form of explosions or fire. The descriptions of all of these people are very, very similar. It's, silent, very quick, and just leaves a trail of dead bodies, animals and humans and plant life behind it. So this description, and I hope I I do it justice, but this was sort of the end of the Sumerian civilization and the Sumerian empire itself. It was a long period of deterioration, and obviously we don't know what would have happened had this not been the case. But nevertheless, this was the sort of final nail in the coffin on that great civilization. And so, obviously, when the Anunnaki realize what has happened and what has taken place, they are both shocked and they are very much regretting the decisions that led to that point. And something very strange happens if you think about history, and you're probably wondering why we haven't spoken about it a little bit more. At this point, Anu and Enlil decide to do the unthinkable, as it were, and they decide to let Marduk rule for the coming age, as it were. And this is what introduces us to the great civilization of Babylon that we knew, the empire that has probably become one of the most famous empires in the ancient Middle East and East, I should say. And so this is the beginning of the Babylonian Empire, a new era for humanity. And after many, many thousands of years and the 24-year wait for his fortune and fate, Marduk finally arrives at supreme leadership over the area. And so, let me see. Patient Zero says it'd be pretty crazy if man invents time travel in the future, and it turns out it was us doing the God thing. That's actually a very interesting theory that I heard about. I'll keep that comment for later. I'm going to highlight it so I don't forget, because that's an interesting thought, but we'll get to that in a moment. So at this point, I'd just like to say this is sort of where I decided to stop in the Sitchin narrative. Now, this is the end of the third book. I do feel it's necessary to relay the information. Sitchin's next book, The Lost Realms, is about the South American continent and the various civilizations, ancient civilizations that arose there. And it turns in the story, it turns out that the gods who left Mesopotamia in that time, some of them arrived at South America and began establishing civilizations there as well. I decided not to go into any of that, which is a whole huge deal in and of itself, and it's very interesting. But I felt that this very momentous occasion was the point that I'd like to reach in our story. And I think I see a sort of arc from the creation of humanity, which our narrative starts a bit before to realize how we got there, but from the creation to the second destruction, as it were, there seems to be this arc that has really shaped humanity for the thousands of years since. And as the creation of humanity being a very important, shift, I think, in the way we think about ourselves and about our environment and in general, I think a very interesting narrative to consider when we see the human situation today. I feel that this nuclear holocaust that happened, that really did shake the old Eastern world back then, is equally important for us to think about. Because We obviously know about the age of nuclear armament and what it's done to our civilization, to our world, and we are so fortunate to be at a place today where it's not a real, I don't think it's a real threat that people feel because of this whole, mutual deterrent like situation that no one would start it because everyone would lose. But nonetheless, it seems that, for me at least, this story where 4,000, 5,000 years ago, an ongoing war over supremacy, one kind or another, eventually led to two brothers, each wanting to kill each other and one going to the extreme of killing everything around it. Just feels, unfortunately to me, like a mindset that I can easily imagine in today's world. And we see many powerful leaders with nuclear capabilities being ever so eager to even consider those things as an option. And so this arc that I see with the Anunnaki and with humanity, in my mind, that point of violence did two things. One, it left an imprint on the human psyche in general and the way that we perceive this violence and the method of attaining power through violence. And that was something I think that has stayed with us to a certain extent even today, which is surprising considering how often it is proven to be unsustainable in the long run. I'm not going to even talk about special situations, but in general, stability is more easily achieved in times of peace than in times of war. But regardless of my personal political opinions, the Anunnaki's position is what I think is more interesting to think about. And that is that the Anunnaki have gone through this very important change and shift in their relationship from creators to sort of protectors and caretakers, to not equals, but as it were, compatible enough for procreation. And this is an increasing change that seems to have happened to what we saw in the later civilizations of worship, bordering on, demanding self-sacrifice of their soldiers and priests in order to worship them. And finally, we arrive at utter decimation and complete destruction in the name of supremacy one way or another. And this seems to be a turning point for the Anunnaki, in much the same way that when the flood happened, when the deluge occurred, then the Anunnaki, and Enlil specifically, became softer or saw the humans in a different light and regretted what had happened. At this point, it seems the Anunnaki have decided to take a step back from their, as it were, meddling in human affairs. Now, this doesn't mean that they reached that level of disappearance that we obviously see in our lands today, and we're going to be approaching that subject later on in the podcast, but it does seem to be a turning point where the Anunnaki feel the responsibility that they hold for the welfare of humanity and of Earth to be much more real and with real-world consequences. And as a result of this, some of them at least seem to be a little more careful and cautious with the big decisions that they take. And so this shift seems to again push even more control into the hands of the human leaders, the kings, and it's not long after this that the ruling changes from the actual Anunnaki to the kings of the humans. And in this shift, there is this whole changing of the guard once more, as it were, between the Anunnaki and the humans, only it seems that the humans are still lacking that responsibility that the Anunnaki are now privy to. And when this happens, when the change happens, a lot of the kings, the human kings, seem to be even more vicious, even more ruthless towards their fellow humans. And sadly, this once again is a rather common phenomenon in human nature where often those who are sort of closer, as it were, will be more, vicious, will feel as though they are actually more distant than complete strangers. Not always, clearly, but in times of desperate measures and when people have been pushed, I'll give a very quick example that I always come to, but the Judenrat in Germany, for those who don't know, was a sort of a group of Jews who were appointed to look after the other Jews. And so this proved to be much more effective than using, Nazis or Germans in general. The same was actually in Egypt. I'm not sure why all my examples are from Jews. There's probably a reason. But this is a well-known tactic. They use, the same people in order to attack them, and this makes it much harder for them to deal with it. So, wow, that was a lot of rambling, excuse me. But we have reached the end of our narrative. I'm very excited to say thank you so much to everyone who's been with me until now and even just from now. I see a few people in chat. Sackley. I hope I'm pronouncing that word right. Or ADS Ackley. Thank you very much for joining, Mariano. Alien Honey, great to see you. Thank you. And, I keep forgetting Gecko. What is it? Gecko, yes. Thank you very much to all of you for joining me. Once again, I will say that next week is going to be sort of a Q&A, and we'll see it's going to be a sort of restructuring a little bit. But starting from the week after, we are technically entering the series about Drunvalo Malchizedek. Once again, if you want to read up a little bit before or see what I'm talking about, the guy behind Spirit Science, the very famous YouTube animation about spirituality, is all based on a book by Drunvalo Malchizedek, and we're going to be talking about him and his theories, let's call them. However, before we enter any of the really heavy stuff, as it were, I feel the need for us to go over a few episodes where we're just going to talk about some concepts, sort of a dictionary, as it were. A, so that when I say these terms, we all are in agreement as to what I'm talking about and what it means. And B, more importantly, a lot of these terms, well, I don't know who the audience will be, but some of them might be, let's say, a little out of the ordinary, shall we call it? I mean, if you're listening to this podcast, so you're probably already quite on board with the some of the unbelievable. But I feel that it's necessary to start this at the same point with everyone. And so, what do you call it? In Hebrew, you call it like to straighten a line. I don't remember what you call it in English, but where we're all starting from the same point. So things like soul and consciousness and the difference or the relationship between them, and the afterlife, death, birth, reality, all of these very, very I think sometimes broad concepts. Not that we're going to completely and absolutely define everything, as we know we can't do that, but we are going to offer the suggestion of what I mean when I say this word, so that we can all understand it. Now, I'd be interested actually to hear from Chad, if you're there, what, when it comes to spirituality versus, let's say, rationality, as it were, what sort of numbers, what people define themselves? Do you find yourselves being more rational, more, emotional, intuitive? I'm not sure what the proper terminology is, but which side of the scale? Because I personally, as you'll all know since I've mentioned it many, many times, I came from complete rationality, atheism and reductionism, not believing in anything that isn't part of the five senses, basically. And I've come a long way from there. Today, I believe in a lot more than I don't believe, as it were. So before we start getting into this, really, one moment, excuse me. Sorry about this. My throat is really giving me some trouble. I apologize. Before we get into this very heavily, we're going to go over some of these concepts and ideas and see how can it be. So, for example, an aura. I'll just give this as a quick taster for what's coming ahead. Some of you may know what it means, have an opinion on what it means, have never heard of it. But an aura seems to be something that's very hard for many people to exactly articulate what it is. And for me, as I went through this journey, it was very, very important to always be able to tie in the rational side and to find the patterns and the connections between the two. And so, just for example, the aura is nothing more than the electromagnetic pulse that our body generates. As we all, I think, know, we have a few electrical sources in our body. The brain is one, the heart is another. And any electrical source emanates a magnetic field along with an electrical field. This is what electromagnetism basically is. And so the aura is simply the frequency of the magnetic and electromagnetic field that's generated by these bodies. So that sort of thing is what I'm talking about. We're going to go over a few of these terms. I don't know how many episodes I'll do. I'll see how it goes, and I'll see how you feel and if you guys are getting anything out of it, or if it's sort of a little bit beneath you, as it were. And then we're basically going to start with the book from page 1. And that's also where he describes a lot of these things and explains a lot of these terms in his own words. So it's going to be all building up towards it, obviously. Okay, I see a few things in chat that I've missed. So I'm just going to go back a little bit. Mariano. Enkidu and Gilgamesh. We didn't even talk about Enkidu and Gilgamesh. Look at the size of the lion. Yes. Well, there's a lot of ancient mythological demigods, etc., who were, portrayed in various sizes. And in fact, there's the place in Jordan that has these huge archways. Patient Zero says rational agnostic. I think that's one of the best answers I can imagine. Nice. I very much appreciate agnosticism. Is that how you say it? And rationality is always important. I try to always be rational. And then again, intuition is also important, but definitely a bit of both. Let's see. Rondon. Robert Sepher. I don't think I've heard of him. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to check it out later. Atlantean. What does it say? Nice. Atlantis. We're actually going to be talking. Drunvalo Malchizedek is the one who covers Atlantis more than this is sort of the, I would say, competing, because they're not even competing, but as it were, an alternative narrative to human history. And in my mind, the two are actually very, very close together. But we'll get to that later on, as it were. Revised Sociology says, my take on the distinction between the rational and spiritual, I can't summarize it. This is, it's hard enough for me to try and talk about it for an hour. So to ask you to summarize it in one sentence. But your answer has told me exactly what I wanted to know, which is, what your position on it is. And if that's your answer, that's a very good place to be. I feel very much the same. These subjects are a little too big, too early in the morning, too late at night, I don't know. But for me personally, these are the subjects that really invigorate me and get me, really the thinking. That's where it happens. Gosh, I can't express myself. Because I can see in chat as well. Ronnie actually puts forth a great hypothesis about the Atlantean people and where they went. I'd be very happy to hear. By the way, Sitchin also does mention Atlantis, but he doesn't go into much depth about it. He talks about it since it's sort of mentioned in the histories as this mythological place, but he doesn't portray it from a first person's perspective, only stories about it. Mariana, you're a theologian, right? That's how I pronounce it. Excellent. Oh, wow. So this is all very, very good news. I remember that there was a comment I wanted to refer to. Patient Zero, yes. It'd be pretty crazy if man invents time travel. So this, I'm just going to say very quickly because it's not a very important point, but I first heard of this theory a few, about maybe 10 years ago, something like that. And until then, this idea was always us and them. The Annunaki versus humanity, aliens in general, evil spirits. It's always these two sides fighting each other, and one is sort of trying to enslave the other. And then came for me the Eastern mysticism, theology, etc. And that was all, well, part of it was all oneness, and everything is the same and everything is one, and it's all different sides of the same thing, and you can't differentiate anything. And these two theories seem to be very incompatible, as it were, either one or the other. But then when I heard about this theory of time travel, which I don't think it's so much invents at that point, personally, I believe that time is more an experience than an event. Meaning, if time is relative, as I think we sort of see and accept, then time itself is the motion of the universe. But that it is not something that we determine. We only determine the speed with which we experience it. So even if we're talking about something like the speed of light, we don't experience things at the speed of light, though our body may work close to that speed. We experience things on a very personal level. And that experience is what we call time, as it were. So in my mind, at least, this notion of inventing a machine that can bend it is very different to reaching a level of consciousness where the perception of time changes. And whether this is very small, uncontrollable moments, such as people seeing into the past or seeing into the future, dreams or awake, or whether it's much more substantial, as someone who is capable of moving their entire being throughout this, time-space continuum, is an interesting topic that we won't get into right now. I don't think we have enough time. But it's certainly an interesting theory to think that man evolves to such a point where he is able to then return and interact with a past, less evolved self. And this cycle, I don't know, something about that cycle for me feels like it's an effective, efficient way of doing things. It's a little bit like that theory that there is only one electron in the universe, and it's traveling through space-time, not linearly, so it can be in two different places. So it's just one electron interacting with itself, and that is all the creation. These theories of this sort of bending in on itself through the element of time, through the dimension of time, as it were, and then interacting with itself in that way and causing new things to happen, as it were. That seems to be very similar to the way the universe acts. If we look at the beginning, how did we become? Well, let's talk about the Big Bang itself. The most accepted, as it were, theory. We started as this, very, very condensed matter, and then it expanded, and then it started to cool. And as it started to cool, the different parts started to mix with each other and to create something new from the mixture. And that process basically led to where we are today, as it were. So obviously billions of years and lots of different changes. But that theory seems to me, the pattern of that theory seems to remind this view of an electron or an evolved human being, consciousness, going back and interacting with, the past version of itself, something else, in order to create something new, which is this evolved human being. So, I don't know. For me personally, it's just an interesting theory, but I don't know too much about it, and I've seen quite a few people claim to be time travelers, but I've never seen one claiming to be both a time traveler, a human, and the Annunaki specifically. But it'd be interesting. Be very interesting nonetheless. Anyway, okay, we've got 6 minutes left. Excellent. So let me just check in chat. Is that everything? Wonderful. So I hope you enjoyed this series with Sitchin. I know, I'll be honest, of the 4 series, in my mind, this is the least, entertaining, as it were. It's much more practical. It's much more, rational, as it were, academic. It's something that I felt was necessary as the first part, just in case there might be someone out there who's listening at some point in the future who has never heard about these things, doesn't see how any of this could be possible, how could all of this have happened without us ever knowing about it? Sitchin, I think, is one of the best places to start. If you're into, the research and stuff. Some people are much more open to this information and have a much easier time than I did. But for me to get into it after so many years of rejecting anything that could be this, startling and different, Sitchin was such an important part of entering. And again, as I developed in my understanding and researched it more and more, I most definitely moved past Sitchin's ideas and his narratives because they were simply not too narrow, but sort of simpler. They weren't meant to give an answer to everything, the things that we can know and the things that we can't. They were meant to prove academically to everyone that this hypothesis was a legitimate one and should be taken seriously. And although he definitely has not yet received the credit, but he, I think, did an amazing job of making it as serious and academic as could possibly be. Drunvalo Malchizedek, on the other hand, as I've mentioned before, claims that all of his information came to him through interactions. What do you call it? With, what do you call it when there's a transmission of information? I can't remember the term. But all of his knowledge came to him through these transmissions, as it were. So that's a very different method. And I felt it better to start with Sitchin, move on to the other, let's say, more esoteric, because that might be a better transition for some, at least. Yeah, a vision. Yeah, it wasn't even a vision because it was actually for him in his descriptions. It was a real interaction for long hours. He was taken as his apprentice. It's a fascinating story. Again, I really implore anyone who wants to know more, get into it. I even have the PDF if you'd like me to send it personally. His book, which is like 2-part, is really interesting, the story that he tells of how he came into it. I'm not going to go into that, obviously, because I don't think that's what's crucial for me to get out right now. What we're going to go over is the actual information, as it were, the knowledge as to how reality works and what humans are here to do, etc. And a quick side note, just before I forget, I wanted to mention this week, in case you haven't heard, because there's a lot going on. And channeling, thank you, Patient Zero. No, channeling, no. It wasn't channeling either. Channeling is when you give your body to be the vessel, whether it's writing, speaking, whatever the method. But that's usually when you either lose control or give control over, as it were. And often when the people are channeling, they're not aware of what they're channeling until after. There have been many famous people, but in his descriptions, Drunvalo, it's sort of a vision, really. It's just that I think a vision is sort of closing your eyes and having this one-sided look into what's going on, whereas with his descriptions, it's really a conversation where this person is sitting next to him and explaining things and touching reality. If we'd call it a hallucination, then it was an auditory and visual hallucination. Obviously, we don't call it that, but that's what it was. Oral law is like, how it's passed on. The thing is that he's, technically wasn't really there. The god, as it were, in question, if I didn't mention it, was Thoth. But anyway, I can see that my time is running out, so I'm going to have to leave you for now. But thank you very, very much for joining. Hope to see you all next week with the new series. Again, if you have any questions about Sitchin, about what we've been talking about, then make sure you prepare them for next week. And if not, then we will have a special surprise regardless. Okay, that's it from me. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful week.